for international law to be Africanized. Since 1963, Africa has steadily produced its own body of international law, as one can see in the book, referred to as African international law through multilateral treaties, legal instruments, and institutional mechanisms. These instruments have been developed through organizations like the Organization of the African Unity and its successor, the African Union, addressing a wide range of issues from economic integrations and human rights to security and environmental protection. The book then spans to look concretely of a few examples, and perhaps if you allow me, I would like to just point out to some of the innovations that I found both in chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 spans on how the African international law has evolved, not only to address specific legal issues, but also to shape African identity in response to colonial and neo-colonial pressures. African international law forms part of an ecosystem where law, politics, and society interact to reflect the needs of the continent. The book frames African international law as part of a broader decolonization project aimed at achieving political, economic, cultural emancipation from the foreign domination. In this same chapter, the author has also provoked us, especially some of us who are scholars, African scholars, but whose knowledge production has been perhaps shaped from the Western side, asking, reflecting on how the influence of the teaching of the learning experience from the African scholars taken from the West, how it then reflects in the production of African legal scholarship. I think this is a very valid point to point, especially when we think about, as it is reflected in the book, about the creation of the African solutions for African problems. If in many instances, this knowledge that we acquired is also done through African institutions. Chapter 4 then further expands and examines of the evolution of international law, and then here it looks specifically at how different African mechanisms have sought to deal with this knowledge production. For instance, how organizations such as the African Court on Human and People Rights and other organizations that goes beyond that, for instance, the Peace and Security Council, stand as pivotal instruments in uploading the norms and the commitment across continents. The book then invites us to reflect on both the successes and the challenges of the African international law faces, including on the issues of non-implementation, but also external influences. One of the things that I also found interesting, perhaps to not take much of the time, is that as we reflect on this theory of the African international law, the book invites us to break previous cycle of reflection on such issues, and then to emphasize what do we want as we move forward for the future of international law in Africa, beyond the reliance on foreign models and looking, as Misha was saying earlier, for homegrown solutions and locally driven solutions. So to me, when I think about this book and I reflect perhaps as part of a community, if we think about this concept of Africa, of what being an African means or Africanness, which you clearly initially reflected upon, that is not one solution that fits all. To me, as part of someone who has been a scholar from the African Lusophone countries, I think there is a further engagement at this book that I would like perhaps here, not directly to you, Misha, but to suggest to Pulp, because I think still, even as we discuss knowledge production and African international law, we discuss it very much from a point of view of some of the colonial languages, for instance, in English. And I think the added value of this book would be actually to launch the challenge to Pulp. So in order to be able to translate this book, this is a very much needed book to other African audiences, such as the Portuguese speaking and thinking of Arab countries and even French-speaking countries. All of those different audiences, if we were to talk and to engage in deeper in homegrown solutions, we need also to take in account some of these barriers that we still deal with, and the fact that much of this knowledge will not be accessible unless we effectively master one of those languages. So I would like to end here this initial intervention by inviting Pope to think through how we can make this book more available to other people who might not speak English and might be from a different audiences. For sure, this is a book that I will be recommending to our Portuguese-speaking audiences, but I'm aware of the limitation that it brings. Thank you very much, Micha. This is a really remarkable contribution to the literature, and I look forward to further engaging with your books in my teaching and in talking about Africa with my fellow Africans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Awa, for those, I think, provocative remarks and challenges to Pulp. Just maybe to make the point that Awa is certainly a Lusophone lawyer, and she hails from Guinea-Bissau. So just to locate her also in the African context. Then we have Nsongurua Udombana, great friend and great scholar, as Misha has indicated. We look forward to your reflections, please, Nsongurua.
Thank you, Franz. Good to see you again after a meeting in Algiers. I want to also thank the publisher for bringing out this great work. And of course, I want to thank Micha, the author. Even though we have not met visibly, we have met in print. And I'm really humbled by your comments regarding my works. I find this book quite fascinating and a brilliant contribution to scholarship. Because of limitation of time, I will only highlight some of the issues. Actually, a good book is not just measured by its contents, but by the issues that it generates for further thought and research. And so I want to highlight just a few points. I might not be able to speak to all of them, given the time constraint. The first point that is that this book brings out is actually what it means to speak of a theory of law, because the title of the book is A Theory on Africanizing International Law. So what does it entail to speak of a theory of law, and to what extent has the author been able to satisfy that idea, the characteristics of a theory of law? And then the second point is that arises from there is the methodological concerns. The issue, so there are some methodological issues that arises from the brilliant work, which I might just address one or two of them if within the limited time. And then there is also the challenge of defining Africanness, the theorizing of Africanizing international law. Of course, raises the question of what does the concept of Africa or Africanness connotes. We can't speak of African international law without actually defining that idea, that concept. And then, of course, I also raised the issue of limitations of the neat structure analysis in the book, which time might not permit for us to go into details. And then I think I also see a danger of a purely context-dependent approach, and a few other things. But let me just speak to one or two of these issues because of limited time perspective. And the first one is defining a theory of law. Now, the book is titled A Theory of Africanizing International Law. And a crucial starting point is to examine what constitutes a theory of law. At a minimum, a theory of law should provide a robust and meaningful framework for understanding and analyzing legal principles. And to achieve this, it must clearly articulate, it must be clearly articulated, logically consistent, free from contradictions, and comprehensive in addressing relevant legal aspects. it should also be consistent with established legal practices, accurately explain and interpret legal phenomena, predict future legal developments, and offer guidance on what the law ought to be. Now, a theory of law should also be supported by empirical evidence, adaptable to changing social and legal context, incorporate insights from other disciplines, and take into account the historical, cultural, and social context of the law. I believe that Mitchell's book meets many of these criteria to qualify as a theory of law. And by challenging dominant Western perspective, he emphasizes the importance of African context and needs, drawing on diverse disciplines such as law, politics, philosophy, sociology, and history to provide a holistic framework for theorizing African international law. So I think on that score, it's a wonderful contribution to knowledge. But there are still some questions that I might need to pose for reflection. And one is the methodological concerns. The first issue relates to the author's methodology. Mitchell adopts a middle ground approach between extremes of absolute methodological choices. That's at page 28 of his work. He argues that while his methodological choices are relative, the research results are absolute. Okay, and I find this notion problematic. Methodology and results are intrinsically linked. The former inevitably influences the latter. Relative methodological choices suggest subjectivity in research findings, shaped by personal biases, cultural context, and theoretical assumptions. So if the methodology is relative, the research results logically must also reflect the limitations and perspective of that methodology. Acknowledging the relativity of both methodology and result allows for a more nuanced and contextualized understanding of research questions. Now, these are just some of the questions that came to my mind while going through Mitchell's works. And then there's also the challenge of defining Africanness. Even though the author seemed to want to operate from a clean slate of not looking at what made up the Africa, but theorizing an African international law actually requires us to confront that question of Africanness. So the author seeks to understand why and how certain issues are framed as problems of common concern to the African people, requiring common legal solution. That's African solution to African problems. However, any researcher analyzing African international law must first define the concept of Africanness. The author describes Africa as a constructed social reality with a fabricated common history and an invented destiny in unity. This characterization has merit, given Africa's extraordinary diversity. For example, in 2002, the then OAU asserted that no African country is a replica of another, and no African society is a mirror image of another. Now, even Africa's legal systems are diverse, influenced by various European legal traditions, but still retaining significant variations. For instance, former British colonies often follow common law traditions, while those with histories tied to French, Belgium, Spanish, or Portuguese colonization adhere more to the Romanist legal framework. So, given this background and context, I wonder whether it's actually possible to come up with an African international law as such. These are just questions that arises from reading the beautiful work. And then I think there's also limitations. Probably this will be my last point because of time, but there are other issues which I would like to address. But I think there's limitation of need structure analysis, which the author focuses on. One of the arguments the author canvasses is that, and I quote, certain international legal developments in Africa could be better understood by adopting a lens that keeps one attuned to the feelings resulting from distinct needs that are unmet, to then grasp the actions that are envisaged to meet those needs. He then explores in chapter 3 a range of psychological motivators that could explain the norm-making behavior of African actors. Now, his need structure analysis offers a framework for understanding the practice of sound lawmaking in any system. However, the hypothesis falls short in explaining the failure of homegrown laws that result from broad-based consultations. It does not account for the failure of international laws that are not related to their method of creation. One possible explanation could be that human needs are universal, and the rules designed to address them do not necessarily need to be culture-specific. This possibly explains why many of the legal rules formulated to create an African international law appear to be a patchwork of diverse influences. Now, before I just hand over to Hanover, I just want to mention there's also the issue of the sources that the author has used to come up with the African international law. Now, if we leave aside the problem of soft law, I mean, the weight that to be attached to soft law, many of the treaties which have been interrogated in this book have been adopted by the OAU and the African Union, but several African states have either not ratified these treaties, or those that have ratified have not taken domestic measures to transform them into domestic law for purposes of implementation and adjudication. And that raises a question. If there is no political will by African states to actually follow through the adoption of treaties, and we know there are several such treaties that have not been ratified, that have not entered into force, even though the book has invoked them, can we really come up with an African international law in the areas of economic integration, in the areas of human rights, in the areas of international criminal law, and the rest of them? So these are some of the issues that the book throws up to me. But just to recap, this is a fine, excellent, brilliant book which is going to stimulate further reflections and thought in the coming months and coming years. And I want to commend the author again and the publisher for this brilliant and excellent work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Udumbana. I think for looking into the concept of theory building and how the book advances that, but also posing some perhaps provocative ways of deepening our reflections and an engagement with the book. And I'm sure we'll hear maybe a few answers and further engagement on these issues from the author as we go along, and maybe from other members in the audience. So thank you very much for your contribution. Let's move on to our third and final panelist, Professor Danwood Chirwa. Danwood, as we heard, was a former teacher of the author. He did his master's at the University of Cape Town, and he is now also affiliated, but I think Professor Chirwa speaks here in his capacity as an expert on international law, international human rights law, and we look forward, Danwood, to your inputs as well. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. This is such a wonderful event. Thanks, Franz, for inviting me to be part of this. Micha, congratulations once again on a wonderful piece of work that you have given us. There are definitely many questions that it raises, and it provokes all of us as researchers to be interested in what you have done and to think about how else some of these issues we could take them further forward. I must appreciate Ms. Barda for your introductory remarks, because they really gave us some depth into what the book is all about, which I will not repeat. And then Songkrowa, whom I'm meeting for the first time vicariously, but met in print, so to speak, as you have said, and appreciate the work that you have done over the years. Has gone further from there to point out some of the critical questions that work posits, but also some of the challenges that remain for all of us who are thinking about theorizing African international law. And in many respects, because of the extent of the barriers, the challenges, conceptual and otherwise, even methodological, it more or less makes us be afraid to take on this key important question. So in the review that you asked me to do the endorsement, that's the first point to note, that you were very brave because there are so many conceptual barriers. The breadth of the topic, the amount of sources one needs to consider, it's so huge. And yet you overcame all of that to come up with something that is quite penetrating. You look at so many sources and reflect, so you're not bound, you're not kind of misdirected into discussing the nitty-gritty. You're very reflective in this, and that's quite something. The second major observation I make is that when we talk about Africanization of law, in the context of recent debates on decolonization, it becomes very politically charged, and it can also be exclusionary. And you have overcome that as someone who might be called an outsider, to ignore all of that and say, I will go and look at this question from an objective perspective as a scholar. I would like to congratulate you also for showing that courage to get into this topic the way you have done it. The key question that you ask here is whether there can be African international law, or can international law be Africanized? It's quite a loaded question, and you even ask, what is African about African international law? Exactly what Professor Dumbana is also in some ways asking. Can we really talk about something like that? Is there an identity that can be said to be African? And at the University of Pretoria, I have heard and read about a professor there, probably is in this meeting, Professor Ngwena, who has a lot to say about that identity, African, whether it is actually African identity. And so it's an important question, but it can also be limiting, because we know there are some states that identify themselves as African, over time have accepted that identity and are operating and agreeing, coming to adopting agreements that are said to be African, or at least regulating them. I think these questions you're asking really turn on the old question about how norms travel. Normally, we think of international law norms traveling in a unidirectional way from the top international plane, maybe to regional and then to domestic. Rarely do we think of it coming from the bottom up, from the states to the regional and also upwards. And increasingly, we've also seen that there's also a horizontal mobility of norms. Horizontal in the sense that region to region, there's concepts of north, south relationships. All of those groupings are themselves generating international norms and are in conversations all the time. Although increasingly there's also what can be said, borrowing from each other and all of that. Now, what I understand your book to be doing is to be saying that this is a multi-directional. It goes up, it goes down, it goes sideways, it's a conversation that is always there. It's not a one-way, top-down. And as Africans, we have to take this seriously by looking at what we're producing and asking, is this African enough? Are we contributing original ideas based on our experience about this? And so that is to be commended. I think for all of us as researchers, we need to ask the question, this at the regional level at least, or even sub-regional level, where we are seeing a lot of lawmaking, or international lawmaking as it were, is it really reflecting what our experiences are at the bottom? from the domestic to up to those levels, and how far is it going all the way up to the international space? And of course, there's so many methodological questions that should compel us that would make it analyzing or even tracking the mobility of norms in those spaces. But your book gives us a way in which we can begin to tackle some of these questions. I think I've run out of time, so I could stop at this stage, but to congratulate you for a wonderful piece of work. At least for me, because I'm locked up in the office most of the time, if I get a piece of work like that in the evening before I sleep and read, it makes my day much happier, much better. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Danwood, for those very, very thoughtful interventions. I think that we will then perhaps revert to the author, to Misha, to just give us some sense of how he can respond or take from the remarks made. While perhaps he's collecting his thoughts, I can just say to the audience that yes, Pulp publishes open access. This book is available open access. But if you would want a hard copy, generally our books are uploaded with Amazon or Take-A-Lot. This particular book may not yet be there because it's in the process of being uploaded, but you'll find it there and you can then order a copy print on demand. Otherwise, if you are really hard-pressed to have a hard copy version of this monograph now, you can reach out to Lizette at Pulp, the details on the website, and she can then organize this also as a print on demand copy. Misha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Franz, and thank you for the panelists. Of course, a comprehensive response would take too long, but I do believe that there are a few common threads in what the panelists highlighted that I can quickly address. First and foremost, I fully agree with what Professor Rambana was saying, is that it is about what happens next, right? Like the conversation that I'm having now is because I'm very curious to see what additional conversations we can spark, what kind of engagement we can trigger, what kind of additional reflection that we can inspire. And so that's also why I think I will focus on what is next. And because it aligns with what I had hoped this book to achieve. And to draw on immediately what Professor Balde said about language, that's exactly what the book ends on, is that I do believe not only should there be more availability of the book for other people so that this kind of thinking, and it's not my book, it's just the mentality, the way of thinking about things, thinking critically about things, but also constructively about things, that I hope more people can embrace. And so when she mentioned about, yes, English, but even the other AU languages, most of them are in a way, quote unquote, colonial languages. So I would very much welcome the idea of making these kind of thinking, and again, it doesn't have to be my work, it could be somebody else's work as well, about more local languages, because language reflects, and that's something that Professor Danwood was saying, experience. It reflects identity. And that's exactly where I think we need to go, is we need to have a better understanding of our mixed, plural, multiple identities in order to now come up with frameworks on how to better govern and create harmony among these societies at large, given that we are, at least that's the hope of the African Union and the people and behind it, we want to integrate. We want to create more harmony about these spaces. Increased and improved methods of transport, communication allow for it, but we still need to ensure that it is well regulated for it to be a net sum. So with regard to her remark on language, I couldn't agree more. And I do believe that by paying more attention to language, we can also shape and come up with even hybrid languages that speak to more people and their realities. So, And then this kind of allows me to tie it with Professor Udambana's remark or question about Africanness. And is it possible to create an Africanness? My response to that is absolutely yes. But for me, and the way that I interpreted in the book, was that it is about creating that common African identity. It's not just about taking it from a very local space, which could be Guinea-Bissau, which could be Nigeria, which could be Lilongwe in Malawi, and now just trying to extrapolate one element, draw it up to the international level, and now call it an Africanization. Like, yes, that could happen, but it needs to be a consensus building around what we all can accept as an African citizen, and that this is now part of our shared identity, and that community building that we need to do. So I do believe that it's possible, but Professor Udambana was also referring to, yes, but if we look at what's happening at the AU, does that really count? Like, sure, there are treaties which have, for the record, been adopted by all heads of state. And of course, now the other legal processes come in terms of ensuring their bindingness and their enforcement capacity by the ratification processes, again, depending on what kind of system you follow. I won't go into those details. But what I thought was still remarkable is that there is an increase of that legalization of governance above the nation state. And I've also been interrogated many times about, like, yeah, but what about these regional community building? How, and this ties into the concern that I believe Professor Danwood was raising, like, how does it reflect that kind of universal law or global law, etc.? And would it undermine it, or is it a threat to it? And then we can be brought back into all those kind of fragmentation debates on international law. But that was not my concern in the book. I have no problem with the global governance regimes. As I mentioned in the book, my concern was simply that I do believe that nation-state level governance is becoming increasingly obsolete, and that maybe global governance is premature. Like, we're not there yet to have that global community. But that's why I do believe that the regional, or at least the continental level, is a better zone of governance now. And of course, this is not done in one day. We've been working at it for a very long time. And what I try to do in the book is not just critique, and that was also one of my disappointments initially when I was going through this critical legal literature, is that they do an excellent job in criticizing the system and identifying systemic biases. But I felt dissatisfied because I was looking for solutions, and I couldn't immediately find them. And that is why the book was attempted to be more constructive in terms of not just criticizing and acknowledging that there might be systemic biases, but also trying to identify, and taking a risk for that matter, in trying to propose something that maybe we can do things differently. And there's a quote from Buckminster Fuller who says that there's no point in trying to change a system or fight the reality, but it's better to propose a new model and make the old model obsolete. And that's in a way that what I was trying to do is to emphasize that we need more transparency in this lawmaking. We need more inclusion, different viewpoints, but it needs to be made more participatory and making it possible for people to actually engage actively in this lawmaking and eventually the governance of the continent that we've occupied. I think I can end on that note, trusting that I addressed maybe a part of the different remarks that were made. But again, this is a fantastic conversation, and I do hope we can continue it. But I look forward to the other questions, and I hope also that the conversation will continue. Thank you, Frans.
Thank you very much, Misha. There are, as you see, there are a number of comments posted, I think, by Lizette in the chat. Those are also just, I think, reviews or people who express themselves on the manuscript, maybe as it was converted into a monograph. But it's really open, the floor now. The floor is open to our audience. Let's hear if anyone, some people, you can assist us to see if there are any Yes, I think there is a specific, we must celebrate this book for what it does. It is long overdue. However, thinking of a sequel, would this be a candidate title, Africanizing International Law to Ubuntu and the Reimagining of Global Legal Systems? So perhaps then making the point that there could be deeper reflection and engagement with African epistemologies, especially focusing on indigenous knowledge systems like Ubuntu and other regional philosophies. So perhaps, Misha, that is something that you can just reflect on. The other one is regarding the process to have the book in various languages, just expressing excitement to announce the launch of Incuba LM, the first African language model LM capable of understanding and responding in 5 African languages. You can see the post there under questions and answers. So thank you for those. Perhaps as Misha reflects on the suggestion about Ubuntu and other regional philosophies, we could see if there's anyone else who would like to take the floor with either a question or a comment, suggestion. Are there any indications, please? You're most welcome.
Yes, there is Tezeta who's permitted to speak. Tezeta, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tezeta Mbuya. I'm a lawyer from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and currently working on also Africanization, but this time of the International Dispute Settlement Mechanism. And I'm doing my PhD thesis on this subject at the University of Essex. So this publication is really welcome because I'm doing similar work. And actually, when I saw the publication, I almost jumped because it's very relevant to the area that I'm researching. But at the same time, when we talk about Africanization, there's this idea that Africans did not really agree about the way that norms were produced. And they wanted those norms to be more adapted to their context. But today that we have so many experts, we have the capacity to make our voices heard. I always ask myself why we never seize opportunities to actually express those views. And I'll take a specific example, is the work that is being carried out by UNCITRAL at the moment, especially the working group 2 and 3 and 6. You would see that African countries did not even make submissions. You know, if we have ideas about what international law should be, why are we silent? Why don't we engage in these discussions? I don't know if in this research, Misha had a chance to actually look at the way in which we can engage more and be more vocal. I would just be interested in knowing his perspective on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mbuya. Good to see you or be with you after our time in Arusha together, right? So thank you
Yes.
for your observation. Simpiwe, is there anyone else? We can maybe take one more.
Ms. Tezeta was the only person
Okay.
at the time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let's revert to Misha on those 2 issues, maybe the issue of Ubuntu and the issue of perhaps the inaction and the lack of opportunity use in contributing to the development of international law, maybe by Africans sometimes, as Ms. Mbuya exemplified. Misha?
Thank you very much, Franz. First, on the Ubuntu question, I was having a conversation with somebody else earlier today where I was explaining that for me, this book was motivated from beginning to end exactly by this idea of Ubuntu, which I define as an African conception of solidarity. which can be found in the classic saying of "I am because you are," or "You are because I am," and for me, the whole AU, African international law making project, is to some extent, and that's what I argue in the book, is a border transcending solidarity project, where there should and there is much more that realization that we are all interconnected. And that's also a point that I was making earlier in this intervention, that increasingly we are interconnected, whether it's through trade, communication, transport, disease, as we've seen most recently. And it is that interconnection, increasingly also with the acceptance of the planet, the climate, the nature, the environment, and like how all of this is affecting us. And it is that realization that I think is key, and we should continue to promote it. But I think the question raised in that text box was, what can we do in terms of volume 2 of this book, building on and maybe also reaching out to other regions? For that one, I would say that is a fantastic project, but personally speaking, that is definitely not my project. I'm very much Afrocentric in that sense, is that I'm really personally committed to what we can do on the continent. And I believe that this book, I have been reflecting since the book was launched on what is my next project. And it is here that I feel that my project now is this book. What it did well, I believe, is set up a framework on how to understand how the African international law and governance can have an impact. But I didn't do that impact assessment. So my next project would be, if the first one was framed around the question, what is African about African international law? My next big question will be, the African Union, so what? What exactly, as now that these tools have been developed, now that we have this better understanding of what knowledge is needed to understand how the AU is having an impact and how it could have a greater impact by consequence, if we put on our constructive thinking hat, that would be my next project. But of course, I definitely welcome this idea of others now looking more closely in regions. And this is exactly also why I've been reaching out to people across the globe, because I do believe that the reflections in the book might also serve other people in other continents who have been facing similar empowerment issues or emancipation issues, and believe that the tools developed in the book could help. Then the question by Tezeta sounds indeed fascinating research that I'd love to learn more about as she progresses. Yes, she's right. There's, on the one hand, what I mentioned earlier is that more opportunities need to be created to enhance the participation level for people to make submissions. For example, the Center for Human Rights and Frans Viljoen and his colleagues have been doing really well in terms of contributing to the international law production process. And by seizing these opportunities to voice their concerns, make submissions, etc., but I do believe that it's still very limited. And yes, there's, on the one hand, that's true, more opportunities could and should be created at the AU level. But I think she also made a very important point that once those opportunities exist, people need to seize on them. And that's actually a project that now, with colleagues at the University of Cape Town, colleagues at African Lee, that we're working on a project now to really look into what is the policy-making space of the African Union and what are these other opportunities that could be created. And they've been doing a fantastic job in terms of making legal information more available, including policies. And I think by this digitalization, that we can make use of these new tools and then seize them, and then also create them as new opportunities to enter into this lawmaking space. And I know that the ECOSOC, which is also a key actor of the African Union, has also recently published a book on policy making and identifying entry points on how the people can engage. But you're right, Tezeta, that people need to seize those opportunities as well. And this is where one of the things that I've always had challenges with, and it was a concept mentioned by Professor Urumbana, about political will. And I kept challenging it. I also challenged it in the book, is because I don't find that to be a very analytically useful concept. I think if the people's will is there, meaning there's people individualistically, but also collectively taking steps to push for something, political will is a lag result and might follow later on. But I think we need to get rid of that idea of political will and really emphasize and deconstruct what's behind it. And I think that's the only way making progress. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you very much, Misha. Let's quickly see if Femi Omere, you can pose your question quite briefly or make your comment quite briefly. I realize that we are close to the top of the hour. We promised to have a 1-hour session, so we are in dangerous territory. But Femi, let's hear from you as the last person on the floor.
Can you hear me? So firstly,
Yes,
congratulations. I met Mika just a couple of days ago, which is fantastic. So I'm glad to be here. In fact, Mika, you just mentioned a word that is almost so you kind of anticipated what I wanted to talk about, which was on the digital front. Much of what is happening in our current age revolves around digital spaces. And what's happened, of course, globally is that that's almost been monopolized by giants out there. There is a push and perhaps an alternative way to do things. And I've just wondered whether within the kind of grander scheme and project that idea of kind of self-hosting spaces, self-hosting discussions, so that we can actually have some safe spaces in which to develop some strategies as well. These are quite granular issues, but I'm just wondering that the necessity of doing things in the open is required at times, but there's certainly times where we need to sit behind closed doors to kind of break things down. So is that part of the strategy, and are you looking for those spaces that can provide such qualities? Thank you.
A brief answer, Misha. Thanks.
Yes, of course. I think there is time for transparency, but transparency is also not an absolute ideal. So I definitely believe that there is need for safe spaces to overcome and admit issues of insecurity and knowledge gaps. And I think those spaces can then be conducive to come up with more formulated, better formulated, more thought through, detailed approaches. So I think both need to be there. And I don't want the idea of my book saying that transparency is an absolute ideal. I do believe that there is, again, relativity there as well that needs to be applied. And only then can it be also instrumentalized for the good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for those questions and comments. We now go back to the panelists for literally just 1 minute, one additional reflection from each of the panelists having listened through the rest of the discussion. Let's use the same sequence. Awa?
Thank you. Indeed, I would just like to go back and again, congratulations for this book. I think it's an amazing addition to the existing literature. I look forward to continue to engage with this book. I think even the audiences have asked thought-provoking questions, and I particularly liked your replies because I think sometimes the challenge when we study international law is to kind of focus on our main goal, and you see very Africanist at the core, and not being distracted from other processes that are happening outside African Union context. And I think that's a very valid approach because it really adds and gives visibility to issues that are our own. I look forward to continue to see where your scholarship will take you, but rest reassured that I will find opportunities for you to bring your voices to the peripheries of some of these African languages that we have spoken to. Thank you again for the kind invitation to be here with you today. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Nsongurua. Professor Udombana, you are there?
I think he's not unmuted. Yeah.
I'm coming. Sorry about that. Are you hearing me now?
Yes, continue, please.
Yeah. I can only congratulate Misha again for an excellent work. There's no time again for any substantial comment. I know that he reached out to me at the point when the book was going to print and was asking for an endorsement, but I couldn't because of some health challenges at the time. So we will definitely continue engaging each other on some of the thoughts, on some of the issues that you have raised in this excellent book. I think your work would definitely stimulate critical thinking about the role of international law in Africa, and it will also encourage readers to question existing power structures and relationships. So once again, I want to thank you, and I look forward to further collaborations on some of these issues. Definitely our path have crossed even before now, at least in print. So we'll look forward to further engagement on some of the excellent issues that you have highlighted. Once again, congratulations. Again, congratulations to Paul and France. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Danwood, as the last panelist to comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, Abed, given what has been discussed here, I have to read the book again. I think that's the that's the thing, the first thing I'll do. The second is on a light note. So we do get a lot of students from Europe, and sometimes we get the sense that they also want to do some holidaying in Cape Town and Namibia and all of that. And Micha is one exception who came here. Of course, many exceptions, who came here and went to do 2 degrees, other master's degrees, and then a PhD, and decided to come to Africa and work at the African court. And is embedded in the African continent. I really appreciate that, and you've produced a wonderful piece of work. So you're one of the most distinguished alumni we have had the privilege of hosting at UCT. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. So let me then conclude by just also adding my word of thanks. I think thanks very much to the audience who listened in, participated. I think before you have to perhaps leave, I prioritize you. I think without you, I think we would not have had this webinar. So thank you very much for your attendance. To the panelists, thank you for making yourselves available, for sharing your reflections and enriching the discussion so much. You all, I think, panelists, thank the author, but I should thank him also for choosing pulp, for allowing pulp to take care of your very, very treasured young child. And we hope we've done a good service. And it's also to our credit that we're able to publish a book of this particular thematic concern. So thank you for that. Let me then, inside the House of Pulp, just say that every book we receive is given to one of the Pulp editorial board to shepherd. That means the person has to ensure that the review process in particular goes smoothly and take the manuscript really into a book. And this was Professor Marty Bradley. She used to be at the University of Pretoria. She's now at the University of Johannesburg. I want to specifically thank her for her shepherdship of this book. But once it is in content approved, it then becomes the young child of Lizette Herman, who is the pulp manager, and she has done an excellent job. If you look at the book, there are graphs and figures and artworks. It is really a special publication. It is very elegant and I think very accomplished as a publication. So thank you to the pulp team, and then also just to our own Center for Human Rights management team in terms of communications. We have some people here. And why is it that the Center for Human Rights is involved? Because pulp ultimately is located also within the Center for Human Rights with the institutional support of the center. So let me leave it at that and just emphasize that there was a question. The book is available, open access. If you go to the chat, if you are not sure, the first chat there shows the link where you can find the book, but otherwise you can also contact us at Pulp if you want a hard copy, or later on order them through Amazon. Thank you once again all for participating. I think it was a glorious occasion, and we all look forward to the many ways in which a theory of Africanizing international law will reverberate in our personal and professional environments. Thank you so much, and a good day to you all.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.